The morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains of Margaret's suburban home in Denver, Colorado, casting gentle shadows across her kitchen table. She sat with her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, staring at her phone screen. For the third time in 10 minutes, the notification was still there, unchanged and unwavering. Call failed. This number has been blocked. Margaret Chen had always prided herself on being a good mother. At 52, she had dedicated the better part of her adult life to raising her son Daniel as a single parent after her husband left when Daniel was just 8 years old. She worked double shifts as a registered nurse at Denver General Hospital, skipped vacations, and sacrificed her own needs countless times to ensure Daniel had everything he needed. But somewhere along the way, everything he needed had transformed into everything he wanted, and that distinction had become the source of their current estrangement. The phone call that had changed everything happened 3 days ago. Daniel, now 26 and living in his own apartment across town, had called with familiar desperation in his voice. "Mom, I need $5,000. It's urgent." Margaret had closed her eyes, feeling the weight of déjà vu settle over her shoulders like a heavy blanket. This conversation had happened before multiple times over the past 2 years. First, it was 2004, a business opportunity that never materialized. Then 3,000 to get back on his feet after losing another job. Each time, she had opened her checkbook, hoping this would be the last time, hoping her son would finally find his footing. "What's it for this time, Daniel?" she had asked, already knowing the answer would be vague and rehearsed. "I told you, it's urgent. There's this investment opportunity, and if I don't act fast, I'll miss out. This could change everything for me, Mom. This could be my big break." Margaret had walked to her bedroom window, looking out at the quiet street where she had raised her son, the same street where she had taught him to ride his bike, where they had waited for the school bus together, where she had watched him grow from a curious little boy into the troubled young man he had become. "Daniel, we've been down this road before. Every opportunity you've described as life-changing has led to disappointment. I've given you nearly $20,000 over the past 2 years, and you're in the same place you were when we started." The silence on the other end of the line had been deafening. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice carried a cold anger that Margaret had never heard before. "So that's it? You're just going to abandon me when I need you most. Some mother you are." "I'm not abandoning you," Margaret had replied, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. "I'm trying to help you in the only way I know how. Giving you money hasn't helped. It's only made things worse. You don't understand anything about my life. You never have. All you do is judge me and lecture me about responsibility. I'm done with this. Daniel, please, let's talk about this." But the line had gone dead, and when she tried to call back, she discovered that her number had been blocked. Now, 3 days later, Margaret sat in her kitchen, grappling with a decision that felt impossible. As a mother, every instinct told her to find a way to reach her son, to fix this rift between them. But as someone who had watched Daniel spiral deeper into financial irresponsibility with each bailout, she knew that breaking down now would only validate his belief that emotional manipulation was an effective strategy. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Linda, who lived in Phoenix. "Any word from Daniel?" Margaret had confided in Linda about the situation, something she rarely did. Linda had always been the more pragmatic of the two sisters, and her response had been both supportive and blunt. "You're doing the right thing, Maggie. Tough love is still love," Margaret typed back. "Nothing. He blocked my number." The response came quickly. "Give it time. He'll come around when he realizes the world doesn't owe him anything." But as Margaret stared at Linda's words, she wondered if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. What if Daniel never came around? What if her refusal to help had permanently damaged their relationship? The questions circled in her mind like vultures, feeding on her maternal guilt and love. She thought about Daniel as he had been as a child, curious, affectionate, always ready with a hug and a silly joke. He had been her little shadow, following her around the house, helping with groceries, and proudly showing her his artwork from school. When had that sweet, eager child transformed into someone who saw her primarily as a source of financial support? The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been gradual, so subtle that Margaret hadn't recognized it until it was too late. It started in college when Daniel had struggled with his coursework and began asking for extra money beyond his tuition and living expenses. "Just to help with books and supplies," he had said. Then it escalated to covering his rent when he quit his part-time job to focus on his studies. Then it became graduation expenses, then moving costs, then job interview clothes, then rent again when he lost his first job out of college. Each request had come with a story, a justification, and a promise that this would be the last time. And each time, Margaret had said yes because she loved her son and wanted to see him succeed. But somewhere in the pattern of giving and receiving, Daniel had stopped seeing her money as help and started seeing it as an entitlement. The breaking point had come 6 months ago when Margaret discovered that Daniel had used the money she had given him for rent to buy a motorcycle instead. When she confronted him about it, he had become defensive and angry, accusing her of not trusting him and treating him like a child. The conversation had ended with Daniel storming out of her house, only to return 2 weeks later with another request for money. Margaret stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the living room, where framed photos of Daniel covered the mantelpiece. There he was at age 5, gap-toothed and grinning in his little league uniform. At 10, serious and focused as he played his violin at a school recital. At 18, proud and hopeful in his graduation cap and gown. Each photo represented a version of her son that she missed desperately, a version that seemed to have been lost somewhere along the way. Her phone rang, and for a moment her heart leaped with hope. But the caller ID showed her coworker Sarah's name, not Daniel's. "Hey Margaret, I'm calling about the schedule for next week. Are you still able to cover Thursday's double shift?" "Yes, of course," Margaret replied, grateful for the distraction. "I'll be there. You sound tired. Everything okay?" Margaret hesitated. Sarah had been a good friend over the years, but Margaret had always been private about her personal struggles. "Just some family stuff. Nothing I can't handle." "Well, if you need to talk, you know where to find me. Sometimes it helps to get an outside perspective." After hanging up, Margaret considered Sarah's words. Maybe she did need an outside perspective. She had been so close to the situation for so long that she couldn't see it clearly anymore. All she could see was her son's anger and disappointment, and her own crushing guilt about standing firm. But deep down, beneath the guilt and heartache, Margaret knew she had made the right decision. She had watched too many parents enable their adult children into a state of permanent dependence, robbing them of the opportunity to develop resilience and self-reliance. She had seen it in her own extended family, where her cousin's 30-year-old son still lived at home, unemployed and unmotivated, because his parents had never required him to face the consequences of his choices. Margaret didn't want that for Daniel. Despite his current anger, despite the pain of their estrangement, she wanted him to become the capable, independent man she knew he could be. And sometimes she realized love meant saying no. As the day wore on, Margaret tried to distract herself with household chores and errands. She cleaned the guest room that Daniel used to stay in when he visited, carefully avoiding looking at the small collection of his belongings he had left behind: a few books, an old sweatshirt, a picture of them together from last Christmas. She went grocery shopping, automatically reaching for the brand of cereal Daniel preferred before remembering that he wouldn't be visiting anytime soon. That evening, as she sat alone at her dinner table, Margaret allowed herself to fully feel the weight of her decision. The house felt too quiet, too empty without the possibility of Daniel's voice on the other end of the phone. She missed their conversations, even the difficult ones. She missed knowing what was happening in his life, missed being able to offer advice and support, missed the feeling of being needed. But as much as she missed those things, she didn't regret her choice. For the first time in years, she was showing Daniel that her love for him wasn't conditional on his financial needs, and that sometimes the most loving thing a parent could do was refuse to rescue their child from the consequences of their own actions. Margaret finished her dinner and settled into her favorite chair in the living room, picking up the novel she had been trying to read for weeks. But as she opened to her bookmarked page, her mind wandered to Daniel, wondering where he was, what he was doing, and whether he was safe. The not knowing was perhaps the hardest part of all the uncertainty about his well-being. The fear that something might happen to him while they were estranged. She closed the book and reached for her phone, her finger hovering over Daniel's contact information. For a moment, she considered trying to reach out through social media or asking one of his friends to check on him. But she stopped herself, recognizing the impulse as another form of rescue behavior. Daniel was an adult, and part of treating him like one meant respecting his decision to cut contact, even when it broke her heart. Instead, Margaret did something she hadn't done in a long time. She turned off her phone, put it in a drawer, and spent the evening in complete silence, allowing herself to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, not controlling, and not fixing. It was one of the hardest things she had ever done, but it was also the most honest expression of her love for her son. 2 weeks had passed since Daniel blocked Margaret's number, and the silence had become its own presence in her life. She found herself listening for sounds that weren't there: the ping of text messages, the specific ringtone she had assigned to Daniel's calls, the familiar sound of his key in the front door during his unexpected visits. The absence of these sounds created a hollow space that seemed to echo throughout her daily routine. Margaret had always been disciplined about maintaining structure in her life, a habit developed during Daniel's childhood when single parenthood demanded careful organization and planning. But now, without the unpredictable interruptions of Daniel's calls and visits, Her routine felt almost mechanical. She woke at 6:30, made coffee, ate breakfast while reading the news, left for work at 7:45 and returned home. At 6 in the evening, the predictability that had once provided stability now felt suffocating. At Denver General Hospital, Margaret threw herself into her work with renewed intensity. She volunteered for extra shifts, took on additional responsibilities, and found herself staying late to help with administrative tasks that weren't technically part of her job description. Her colleagues noticed the change but attributed it to Margaret's well-known work ethic rather than her need for distraction. "Margaret, you've been here since 6 this morning," said Dr. Rivera during her third consecutive 12-hour shift. "When's the last time you took a real break?" "I'm fine, doctor. Besides, we're short-staffed in the cardiac unit, and Mrs. Patterson specifically requested that I handle her post-operative care." Dr. Rivera studied Margaret's face with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read the signs of stress and exhaustion in medical professionals. "You know, being indispensable isn't the same thing as being irreplaceable. Take care of yourself, Margaret. That's an order from your attending physician." Margaret nodded and promised to consider his words, but she knew she wouldn't follow his advice. Work provided structure and purpose to things that felt increasingly elusive in her personal life. At the hospital, she was needed, valued, and capable of making a meaningful difference. At home, she was simply a woman waiting for a phone call. That might never come. The evenings were the hardest part. Margaret would arrive home to find her house exactly as she had left it that morning, no dishes in the sink that weren't hers, no shoes kicked off by the front door, no jacket thrown over the back of the couch. The order and cleanliness that she had once appreciated now felt like evidence of her isolation. She developed new rituals to fill the quiet hours. She started cooking elaborate meals for herself, following recipes she had bookmarked but never tried. She planted a small herb garden in her backyard, something she had always wanted to do but never had the time for when Daniel's crises demanded her immediate attention. She joined a book club at the local library, attended yoga classes at the community center, and even signed up for a pottery class that met on Saturday mornings. These activities provided temporary relief from the constant worry about Daniel, but they couldn't fill the fundamental emptiness left by his absence. Margaret found herself scanning social media for any glimpse of her son's life, a habit she recognized as unhealthy but couldn't seem to stop. Daniel's Facebook page showed a few recent post photos of meals at restaurants she couldn't afford, pictures with friends at bars and concerts, updates about his various business ventures and investment opportunities. The posts painted a picture of someone living a full, active life, which provided both relief and frustration for Margaret. Relief, because Daniel appeared to be safe and socially connected. Frustration, because his lifestyle seemed to contradict his claims of financial desperation, the expensive restaurants, the frequent entertainment, the new clothes visible in his photos. None of it suggested someone in genuine need of emergency financial assistance. Margaret's sister Linda called every few days to check in, and their conversations followed a predictable pattern. Linda would ask if Margaret had heard from Daniel. Margaret would say no, and Linda would offer reassurance that Margaret was doing the right thing by maintaining her boundaries. "You know, Maggie, I've been thinking about this whole situation," Linda said during one of their evening calls. "Do you remember how Daniel used to handle disappointment when he was little?" Margaret settled into her favorite chair, grateful for the distraction of childhood memories. "He was always dramatic about it. Remember when he was 7 and I wouldn't let him have ice cream for breakfast? He told me I was the worst mother in the world and that he was going to run away to live with his teacher." Exactly, and what happened? He packed his little suitcase with his stuffed animals and made it as far as the front porch before he realized he was hungry and came back inside for lunch. Linda laughed. "That's Daniel's pattern, Maggie. Big, dramatic gestures, declarations of independence, and then a quiet return when reality sets in. Then you'll deal with that when it happens. But I don't think it will. Daniel loves you, even if he's too proud and stubborn to admit it right now. He's just never had to face the consequences of his choices before, and that's scary for him, but it's also necessary." After hanging up with Linda, Margaret sat in her living room, considering her sister's words. Linda was probably right about Daniel's pattern of dramatic gestures, followed by reconciliation. But knowing that didn't make the waiting any easier, and it didn't eliminate the fear that this time might be the exception to the pattern. Margaret's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at her front door. For a moment, her heart raced with the possibility that Daniel had come to see her. But when she looked through the peephole, she saw her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who lived alone in the house next door. "Mrs. Chen, is everything all right?" Margaret asked as she opened the door. The older woman looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry to bother you, Margaret, but I locked myself out of my house, and my spare key is inside. I was wondering if I could use your phone to call my son." "Of course. Please come in." As Mrs. Chen made her phone call, Margaret noticed how frail she looked, how unsteady she seemed on her feet. When the call was finished, Mrs. Chen explained that her son lived 40 minutes away and wouldn't be able to come over until later that evening. "You're welcome to wait here," Margaret offered. "I was just about to make some tea." They spent the next 2 hours talking about the neighborhood, about their children, about the challenges of aging and parenting adult children who lived their own lives. Mrs. Chen shared stories about her relationship with her son, including periods of conflict and reconciliation that spanned decades. "You know, Margaret, my son and I went through a terrible fight when he was in his 20s. He wanted to marry a girl I didn't approve of, and I said some things I regretted. We didn't speak for 6 months. What happened? Eventually, he realized that I was trying to protect him, even though I went about it the wrong way. And I realized that he was an adult who had the right to make his own mistakes. We both had to swallow our pride, but we worked it out. That was 30 years ago, and now we laugh about it. Do you think he would have come around if you hadn't reached out first?" Mrs. Chen considered the question carefully. "I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. But I do know that sometimes the person who loves more has to be the first one to bend. That doesn't mean you were wrong to set boundaries with your son from what you've told me. It sounds like you did what you had to do. But when the time comes, you might need to be the one to offer an olive branch." When Mrs. Chen's son arrived to let her into her house, Margaret found herself alone again, but with a different perspective on her situation. The conversation had reminded her that parent-child conflicts, even serious ones, didn't have to be permanent. Relationships could be repaired, trust could be rebuilt, and love could survive periods of estrangement. That night, as Margaret prepared for bed, she made a decision. She would continue to maintain her boundaries regarding financial support, but she would also start planning for the possibility of reconciliation. She would think about what she wanted to say to Daniel when he was ready to listen, and she would prepare herself to be gracious and loving when that moment came. But first, she had to get through however many more days or weeks of silence lay ahead. And as she turned off the lights and settled into bed, Margaret said a quiet prayer for Daniel's safety and well-being, and for the strength to continue doing what she believed was right, even when it felt like the hardest thing in the world. The next morning brought a small breakthrough. Margaret woke up feeling more rested than she had in weeks, and she realized that the constant anxiety about Daniel's next call or crisis had begun to ease. She still worried about him, still missed him, but she was no longer living in a state of perpetual emergency readiness. The peace was fragile and incomplete, but it was there as she made her morning coffee. Margaret thought about the herbs she had planted in her backyard and decided to spend some time working in the garden before leaving for work. It was a simple decision, but it represented something importante. Choice to focus on growth and nurturing rather than fear and regret. The herbs were beginning to thrive in the Colorado sunshine, and Margaret found unexpected satisfaction in tending to them, watering them, and removing the occasional weed. It occurred to her that parenting might be similar to gardening. Sometimes you had to prune back growth that wasn't healthy, even when it looked promising, in order to create space for stronger, more sustainable development. As she drove to work that morning, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: cautious optimism about the future. She didn't know when or how her relationship with Daniel would be repaired, but for the first time since their fight, she believed it would be. Margaret had just finished washing her dinner dishes when she heard the tentative knock on her front door. It was a Thursday evening in late October, exactly 1 month since Daniel had blocked her number, and she had been settling into what had become her new normal routine: work, dinner, reading, and early bedtime. The knock was soft, almost hesitant. Unlike the confident rap that usually announced visits from neighbors or delivery drivers, she wiped her hands on the kitchen towel and walked toward the front door, her heart beginning to quicken with an inexplicable sense of anticipation. Through the peephole, she saw a figure standing on her porch, with shoulders hunched against the early evening chill, but the face was turned away from the door. Something about the posture, the way the person shifted weight from one foot to the other, struck her as familiar. When she opened the door, Margaret felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. Daniel stood before her, but he looked nothing like the confident, demanding young man who had hung up on her a month ago. His hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled and ill-fitting, and his face carried the unmistakable signs of someone who had been crying recently. Dark circles under his eyes suggested sleepless nights, and he had lost weight, making his already lean frame appear almost gaunt. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Margaret's hand remained on the door handle, her mind racing to process the reality of Daniel's presence after weeks of silence and worry. Daniel looked at his feet, then at her face, then back at his feet, as if he couldn't decide whether to run away or collapse on her doorstep. "Hi, Mom," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Can we talk?" The anger and defiance that had characterized their last conversation were completely absent. In their place was something Margaret hadn't seen in Daniel's demeanor for years: genuine vulnerability and what appeared to be shame. She stepped aside without hesitation, gesturing for him to come inside. "Of course we can talk. Come in, honey. You look cold." Daniel walked past her into the living room, moving slowly as if his body ached. Margaret noticed that he was wearing the same jacket he had worn during their argument a month ago, but it now seemed too large for his diminished frame. He sat down heavily on the couch, in the same spot he had always claimed during his visits home, and put his head in his hands. Margaret sat down in her chair across from him, the same chair where she had spent countless evenings over the past month wondering about his well-being. Now that he was here, safe and real in front of her, she felt an overwhelming mix of relief, love, and concern. "Are you okay?" she asked, studying his face with the practiced eye of both a mother and a nurse. "You look like you haven't been sleeping." "Well," Daniel raised his head and looked at her with eyes that seemed older than they had been just a month ago. "I haven't been sleeping well. I haven't been doing a lot of things well lately." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Margaret wanted to reach out and comfort him, to smooth his hair and tell him that everything would be all right, the way she had when he was a child. But she sensed that this moment required something different from her patience and space for him to say whatever he had come to say. "Mom, I owe you an apology," Daniel continued, his voice gaining strength, but still carrying a tremor of emotion. "Actually, I owe you a lot more than an apology, but that's where I need to start." Margaret nodded, encouraging him to continue. "I've been angry at you for a month, telling myself that you abandoned me when I needed you most. I convinced myself that you were being cruel and selfish, that you didn't understand what I was going through." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "But I was wrong about everything." Daniel stood up and began pacing the length of the living room. A nervous habit he had developed as a teenager when he was trying to work through complex emotions. Margaret watched him, noting how his movements seemed less confident than usual, more tentative. "After I blocked your number, I was so sure that I would prove you wrong. I was going to find a way to make money without your help, and then I was going to come back and show you how successful I had become. I was going to make you regret not believing in me." He stopped pacing and turned to face her. "But that's not what happened. What happened was that I finally had to face the truth about myself and the way I've been living." Margaret remained silent, sensing that Daniel needed to tell his story at his own pace without interruption or judgment from her. "You remember that investment opportunity I told you about? The one I said was going to change everything?" When Margaret nodded, Daniel continued, "It wasn't real, Mom. I mean, there was a guy who was promising huge returns on cryptocurrency investments, but it was a scam. I didn't lose any money because I didn't have any money to lose, but I spent weeks researching it, convincing myself it was legitimate, building my whole plan around it." Daniel sat back down on the couch, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "When I realized it was fake, I started looking for other opportunities, other ways to make quick money, and every single one of them was either a scam, or required skills I don't have, or demanded an initial investment I couldn't make. That's when it hit. I've been chasing fantasies for years, always looking for the easy way out, the quick fix that would solve all my problems." Margaret felt her heart ache for her son, recognizing the pain in his voice as he confronted the reality of his situation. She wanted to comfort him, but she also knew that this moment of clarity was crucial for his growth. "But the real wake-up call came 2 weeks ago," Daniel continued. "I lost my job." "Oh, Daniel, no. Mom, let me finish. I lost my job because I deserved to lose it. I was chronically late. I spent time at work researching investments instead of doing my actual work. And I had a terrible attitude because I thought the job was beneath me. I thought I was destined for something bigger and better, so I didn't put in any real effort." Daniel's voice cracked slightly as he continued. "When my boss called me into his office to fire me, he said something that I can't stop thinking about. He said, 'Daniel, you're a smart guy with a lot of potential, but you're also the most entitled person I've ever worked with. You expect success without effort, reward without responsibility. Until you figure out how to change that, you're going to keep failing.'" Margaret watched as tears began to form in Daniel's eyes. She had never seen him cry as an adult, and the sight of his vulnerability broke her heart, even as it gave her hope. "I lost the job. I couldn't make rent. I had to move out of my apartment and stay with friends, bouncing from couch to couch, making excuses about why I couldn't pay them back for food and utilities. And slowly, one by one, my friends started to distance themselves from me. Not because they're bad people, but because I had become someone who only showed up when I needed something." Daniel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture that reminded Margaret of the little boy he had once been. I've been living in my car for the past week, Mom, showering at the gym, eating fast food when I could afford it, trying to figure out how my life had gotten so completely out of control. The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her son had been homeless, sleeping in his car, struggling to meet his basic needs, and she hadn't known. The protective instincts that had been suppressed for the past month roared back to life, and she had to fight the urge to immediately offer solutions and assistance. 2 nights ago, I was sitting in my car in a parking lot trying to figure out where I could go. When I realized something, Daniel continued, every problem I have right now is the result of choices I made. Not bad luck, not unfair circumstances, not other people being mean to me, my choices. And the biggest choice I made was to see you as an ATM instead of as my mother who loves me and wants what's best for me. Daniel looked directly at Margaret for the first time since he had started talking. You were right to say no to me, Mom. You were right about everything. I did need to learn how to be responsible for myself, and I never would have learned that. As long as you kept rescuing me from the consequences of my actions. The words Margaret had longed to hear for years were finally being spoken, but they brought her no satisfaction. All she felt was love for her son and pride in his courage to face difficult truths about himself. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, Daniel said. I know I hurt you when I cut you out of my life. I know I've disappointed you over and over again, but I want you to know that I finally understand what you were trying to teach me, and I'm ready to do the work to become the person you raised me to be. Margaret stood up and walked over to the couch, sitting down beside Daniel and taking his hands in hers. His hands were cold and rough, evidence of his recent struggles. But they were also familiar, the same hands she had held when he was scared. As a child, the same hands she had bandaged when he fell off his bike. Daniel, I forgave you the moment I saw you standing on my porch, she said softly. I never stopped loving you, not for a single second of this past month. But I'm so proud of you for coming here tonight, for being honest about what you've been going through, and for taking responsibility for your choices. Daniel's composure finally broke completely, and he leaned into his mother's embrace, crying with the release of someone who had been carrying a tremendous burden alone. Margaret held him tightly, stroking his hair and whispering the words of comfort and love that she had been storing up during their month of separation. I'm scared, Mom, Daniel whispered against her shoulder. I don't know how to fix this mess I've made. I don't know how to start over. You don't have to fix everything at once, honey, Margaret replied. We'll figure it out together, one step at a time. But this time, we're going to do it differently. This time, you're going to be an active partner in solving your problems, not just a recipient of solutions. They sat together on the couch for a long time, holding each other and beginning the process of healing that would take much longer than a single evening. But as Margaret felt her son's breathing slow and his body relax against hers, she knew that they had crossed a threshold. Daniel had returned to her not as the angry, entitled young man who had left, but as someone who was ready to take the first difficult steps toward genuine maturity and independence. Outside, the Colorado evening grew darker and colder, but inside Margaret's living room, the warmth of reconciliation and renewed hope filled the space between mother and son. 3 weeks had passed since Daniel's return, and Margaret's house had taken on a different rhythm. The spare bedroom, which had sat empty and waiting during their month of estrangement, now showed signs of careful habitation, clothes folded neatly in the dresser, books stacked on the nightstand, and a small notebook where Daniel recorded his daily job search activities and personal goals. The arrangement they had negotiated was unlike any of Daniel's previous stays at home. This time there were clear expectations and boundaries. Daniel would contribute to household expenses through part-time work, while actively searching for full-time employment. He would attend weekly sessions with a financial counselor that Margaret had helped him find. Most importantly, he would participate in rebuilding their relationship through honest communication and consistent follow-through on his commitments. Margaret sat at her kitchen table on a Saturday morning reviewing the household budget she and Daniel had created together. It was a modest document reflecting their shared commitment to living within their means, while Daniel worked to establish his independence. Seeing her son's name next to actual contributions rather than requests for money felt like a small miracle. Mom, I'm heading out to that interview at the warehouse, Daniel called from the hallway. I should be back by noon. Good luck, honey. Remember what we practiced about discussing your employment gap? Daniel appeared in the kitchen doorway, dressed in the professional clothes they had purchased together at a discount store. He looked healthier than he had on the night of his return. He had gained back some weight. The dark circles under his eyes had faded, and there was a purposefulness in his movements that hadn't been there before. I'm going to be honest about why I lost my last job and what I learned from the experience, he said, reciting the approach they had discussed. And I'm going to emphasize my commitment to reliability and growth. Margaret smiled, noting how different this conversation was from their pre-interview discussions in the past. When Daniel had focused on crafting stories to hide his shortcomings rather than addressing them directly, that's exactly right. And remember, even if this particular job doesn't work out, every interview is practice for the next one. Daniel nodded and grabbed his keys from the counter. As he headed toward the door, he paused and turned back to Margaret. Mom, I know I've said this before, but I want to say it again. Thank you for letting me come home, and thank you for not making this too easy for me. The sincerity in his voice still surprised Margaret sometimes. The Daniel who had returned to her was fundamentally different from the one who had left, more thoughtful, more grateful, and more aware of how his actions affected others. After Daniel left for his interview, Margaret began her own Saturday routine, which now included tasks that reflected their new living arrangement. She prepared a grocery list that accounted for Daniel's preferences and dietary needs, but she also noted which items he would be responsible for purchasing with his earnings from his part-time job at a local restaurant. The restaurant job had been Daniel's first concrete step toward rebuilding his life. It wasn't glamorous work. He washed dishes, cleaned tables, and occasionally helped with food preparation, but he approached it with a determination that impressed both Margaret and his supervisors. For the first time in years, Daniel was receiving positive feedback from an employer, and Margaret could see how that recognition was rebuilding his confidence in healthy ways. Margaret's phone rang, and she was pleased to see Linda's name on the caller ID. Her sister had been a crucial source of support during Daniel's absence, and now she was equally invested in his successful reintegration into family life. Hi Linda, how's Phoenix treating you? Hot as always, but I can't complain. How are things with Daniel? Is he still keeping up with all his commitments? Margaret smiled, understanding the concern behind Linda's question. Both sisters were cautiously optimistic about Daniel's transformation, but they also knew that lasting change required consistent effort over time. He's doing really well, Linda. He's been working at the restaurant for 2 weeks now, and his manager already complimented his work ethic. He's got a job interview this morning for a warehouse position that would give him full-time hours and benefits. That's wonderful news. And how is he handling the financial counseling sessions? Better than I expected, actually. At first, I think he was embarrassed about needing help with basic budgeting and debt management. But now he seems genuinely engaged with the process. He's created a plan to pay off his credit card debt, and he's learning to distinguish between wants and needs. Linda was quiet for a moment before speaking. Maggie, I have to ask, how are you handling all of this? I know you're thrilled to have Daniel back, and to see him making progress, but this can't be easy for you either. The question caught Margaret slightly off guard, though she realized it shouldn't have. In her focus on Daniel's recovery and their rebuilt relationship, she hadn't spent much time examining her own emotional journey through the process. You're right, it hasn't been easy. There are moments when I have to actively stop myself from falling back into old patterns, wanting to solve his problems for him, or feeling guilty when he struggles with something that I could easily fix. But I think I'm learning too. Learning. What? Learning that helping someone and enabling them are two very different things. Learning that love sometimes means watching someone you care about work through difficulties instead of removing those difficulties for them. It's hard, but I can see how much stronger Daniel is becoming because he's facing his challenges himself. After finishing her conversation with Linda, Margaret reflected on how much her own perspective had changed over the past few months. The woman who had sat in this same kitchen 6 weeks ago, agonizing over her decision to refuse Daniel's request for money, felt like a different person. She had learned to trust her instincts about tough love, and more importantly, she had learned to trust Daniel's capacity for growth when given the right motivation and support. Daniel returned from his interview 2 hours later, and Margaret could tell immediately that it had gone well. His posture was confident but not cocky, and there was a brightness in his eyes that suggested genuine excitement about the opportunity. How did it go? Margaret asked, though his expression had already answered her question. Really well, Mom. The supervisor said they were impressed with my honesty about my previous work history, and they liked that I've been consistently employed at the restaurant while looking for full-time work. They're going to call me by Monday with their decision. Daniel sat down at the kitchen table across from Margaret, and she noticed how naturally he had fallen into the habit of sharing details about his day with her. During the years of their strained relationship, their conversations had been primarily transactional, Daniel asking for something, Margaret responding with concern or lectures. Now their interactions had the comfortable rhythm of two adults who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. The supervisor also mentioned that they have opportunities for advancement for employees who show initiative and reliability. Daniel continued, it made me realize that I've never really thought about building a career before I was always looking for shortcuts to success instead of focusing on steady progress. What changed your mind about that? Daniel considered the question carefully before answering. I think it was working at the restaurant, actually. At first, I was embarrassed about washing dishes and cleaning tables. I thought it was beneath me, that I was better than that kind of work. But after a few days, I started to notice how the kitchen runs like a machine when everyone does their job well, and how much the customers appreciate good service. He paused, seeming to organize his thoughts. I realized that every job has dignity if you approach it with the right attitude, and that there's satisfaction in doing something well, even if it's not glamorous. I've learned more about work ethic and teamwork in 2 weeks at that restaurant than I did in months, at jobs I thought were more important. Margaret felt a surge of pride at Daniel's words, not just because of the progress he was describing, but because of the thoughtfulness and maturity he was demonstrating in his self-reflection. I'm proud of you, Daniel, not just for the practical changes you've made, but for the way you're thinking about work and responsibility differently. I have a long way to go, Mom. I know that. Sometimes I still catch myself looking for easy solutions or feeling sorry for myself when things are difficult. But now I recognize those thoughts for what they are, and I try to redirect them toward more productive thinking. That evening, as they prepared dinner together, another new tradition in their rebuilt relationship, Daniel brought up a topic that Margaret had been wondering about, but hadn't wanted to pressure him to discuss. Mom, I've been thinking about some of the friends I lost touch with during my difficult period. I want to reach out to some of them and apologize for the way I treated them. Margaret paused in her chopping of vegetables, recognizing the significance of Daniel's statement. That sounds like it might be difficult. Are you prepared for the possibility that some of them might not be ready to forgive you? Yeah, I've thought about that. I'm not reaching out because I expect them to welcome me back with open arms. I'm doing it because I need to acknowledge the hurt I caused and take responsibility for my actions. Whether they choose to rebuild those friendships is up to them. Daniel's approach to making amends reflected the same mature thinking he was applying to other areas of his life, focusing on his own behavior and responsibilities rather than trying to control outcomes or other people's responses. As they sat down to eat the meal they had prepared together, Margaret looked across the table at her son and felt a deep sense of gratitude. Not just gratitude for Daniel's presence and progress, but gratitude for the entire journey they had traveled together, including the painful months of estrangement. Daniel, can I tell you something? Of course. As difficult as our fight was, and as much as it hurt to have you out of my life for that month, I think it was necessary for both of us. You needed to experience the consequences of your choices, and I needed to learn that I could love you fiercely while still maintaining boundaries. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. I think you're right. I was so angry at you for not giving me the money. But now I realize that you gave me something much more valuable, the opportunity to discover that I'm capable of more than I thought I was. What do you mean? Before our fight, I saw myself as someone who needed to be rescued. I thought my problems were too big for me to handle alone, and I convinced myself that asking for help was the same thing as being helped. But these past few weeks have shown me that I'm actually pretty resourceful when I have to be. I can find work, I can manage money, I can solve problems. I just never had to do those things before because you were always there to do them for me. Margaret felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, moved by Daniel's insight and his ability to articulate the lessons he had learned. You were always capable of those things, honey. I think I just forgot to get out of your way so you could discover that for yourself. As they finished dinner and cleaned up the kitchen together, Margaret reflected on how different this evening was from the countless nights she had spent worrying about Daniel during their estrangement. Instead of wondering where he was and whether he was safe, she was able to enjoy his company and witness his continued growth firsthand. Later that evening, as Margaret sat in her living room reading while Daniel worked on job applications at the dining room table, she felt a profound sense of peace. Their relationship was stronger than it had ever been, built on a foundation of mutual respect, honest communication, and shared commitment to Daniel's continued growth toward independence. The house no longer felt empty or hollow with waiting. Instead, it felt full of possibility for Daniel's future, for their relationship, and for the knowledge that love, when expressed through appropriate boundaries and tough decisions, could survive anything and ultimately make everyone stronger. When Daniel said goodnight and headed to his room, he paused at the foot of the stairs. Mom, I love you. Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I gave up on myself. I love you too, Daniel. Sweet dreams. As Margaret turned off the lights and prepared for bed, she knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities for both of them. Daniel would continue building his career and his independence, and she would continue learning how to support him in ways that promoted his growth rather than hindering it. But tonight, she could rest in the knowledge that they had found their way back to each other, stronger and wiser than before. The months of silence, worry, and tough love had been painful but necessary. They had led to this moment a son who understood his own worth and capabilities, and a mother who had learned the difference between loving someone and rescuing them. Together, they had discovered that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is say no, wait patiently, and trust that the people you love are capable of more than they know. Outside, the Colorado night was crisp and clear, full of stars and infinite possibilities. Inside, Margaret Chen fell asleep peacefully, surrounded by the quiet sounds of a home filled with love, respect, and hope for the future.